The cold wind howled through the empty streets as he stepped out of his sleek black Mercedes. Then he saw her, frail, shivering, lost to time. His heart clenched. A ghost from the past. Could it really be her? The city pulsed with life beneath the golden glow of twilight, but to Richard Caldwell, it was nothing more than a series of cold, glimmering towers. He sat in the back of his limousine, the leather seats stiff beneath his aging frame. 60 years. 60 years of building, of accumulating, of becoming a name that echoed through the halls of power. And yet, as the tinted glass reflected his face back at him, all he saw was a man who had outlived something precious. The past had a way of pressing its fingers into the present. Tonight, it came in the form of a faded photograph, creased, edges worn by time, tucked in the inner pocket of his tailored suit. It was absurd, really, to still carry it. The image was nothing but a relic of youth, a girl with wind-tangled auburn hair, eyes that held the mischief of stolen summers. Eleanor. Richard exhaled sharply, his fingers tightening around the fragile photograph. A foolish indulgence, he told himself. Nostalgia had no place in a world dictated by contracts and balance sheets, and yet he couldn't let it go. His driver maneuvered through the bustling city streets, slowing at an intersection where a row of weary souls huddled beneath the flickering street lamps. The homeless. Another part of the city, one that existed in the shadows of his success. Richard barely noticed them at first. Not until his gaze landed on one figure, slumped against the brick wall, wrapped in a coat that was more holes than fabric. There was something about her. Something that sent an ache splintering through his ribs. The scar. A single thin line across her wrist, barely visible beneath the frayed sleeves. His mind reeled back to a summer afternoon decades ago. Eleanor, laughing as she ran ahead of him through the wheat fields, arms outstretched like wings. Then the sudden yelp, the sharp gasp as she tripped, her skin slicing against a broken fence post. He had wrapped his own shirt around the wound, whispering promises that he would always protect her. Now, that same scar rested on the wrist of a woman who had been swallowed by time. Richard's breath hitched. It couldn't be. But as the light from the street lamp illuminated her face, gaunt yet eerily familiar, reality crashed into him with the force of a tidal wave. Eleanor. She was here, alive yet unrecognizable. The girl who had once painted his world in laughter now sat crumpled on the pavement, reduced to a ghost of who she used to be. The weight of his fortune, his achievements, everything he had built, it all felt meaningless in that moment. The past was not done with him, and perhaps neither was she. For a moment, Richard couldn't move. His body remained frozen, his breath shallow, as though one wrong step would shatter the fragile line between past and present. The city, the flashing lights, the impatient honking of cars, it all faded into nothing but the rhythmic pounding of his heart. His fingers trembled as he reached for the door handle. "Sir," his driver asked, glancing at him through the rearview mirror. Richard hesitated. What was he doing? Was he truly about to step out of his world and into one he had long ignored? What if he was wrong? What if this woman, this shadow of someone he once loved, was just a stranger cursed with a resemblance? But then she shifted beneath the glow of the street lamp, and he saw it again. The same delicate jawline, the same curve of her lips, now chapped and pale. Her hair, once auburn and untamed, hung in limp strands streaked with silver. But it was her. It had to be. He opened the door. The December air hit him like a slap, cutting through the warmth of his coat as he stepped onto the cracked pavement. His polished shoes felt out of place against the rough concrete, as though the ground beneath him rejected his presence. The other homeless souls barely spared him a glance. A businessman in their midst was nothing more than a passing ghost, one who would observe, pity, and walk away. But Richard didn't walk away. He took slow, careful steps toward her, his chest tightening with every inch of distance he closed. She was asleep, or unconscious. A thin blanket, frayed at the edges, barely covered her skeletal frame. Beside her, a small paper cup rattled in the wind, a few measly coins clinking against each other. This was Eleanor. This was his Eleanor. A lump formed in his throat, memories hitting him like a flood. The girl who once ran barefoot through the grass, who had sworn she'd never be tamed by the weight of the world. What had happened to her? Where had she gone after they lost each other? Richard lowered himself to one knee, the cold seeping into his bones. Slowly he reached out, his fingers hovering just above her shoulder. "Eleanor." His voice cracked. It was the first time he had spoken her name in decades. Her body twitched. A sharp inhale, then groggy, weary eyes blinked open, unfocused at first. They flitted past him before locking onto his face. For a second, there was nothing. No recognition, no spark, just exhaustion and the instinctive flinch of someone accustomed to cruelty. But then, her breath hitched. A flicker of something long buried flickered in her dull eyes. "Richard?" It was barely a whisper. But in that moment, the years between them collapsed. For a moment, silence stretched between them, thick with disbelief. Richard felt as if time itself had fractured, splintering between the boy he once was and the man he had become. The city hummed around them, cars whizzing by, footsteps echoing against the pavement, but all he could hear was the fragile rasp of her breath. Eleanor stared at him, blinking away the haze of exhaustion, confusion flickering behind her sunken eyes. "Richard," she repeated, barely more than a breath. Hearing his name on her lips after all these years sent a shudder through him, but there was no warmth in her voice, no joy in recognition, only disbelief. He swallowed hard, his throat tightening. "It's me, Eleanor." Her gaze swept over him, taking in the pristine coat, the expensive watch, the well-fed frame of a man who had never known true hunger. Richard knew what she saw, someone who belonged to a different world, a world that had forgotten her. She shrank away slightly, her bony fingers clutching at the thin blanket, as though it could shield her from whatever was happening. He could see it in her eyes now. The doubt, the wariness of someone who had been let down too many times before. "What are you doing here?" Her voice was hoarse, as if speaking took effort. Richard's mouth went dry. What was he doing here? He exhaled, running a hand through his silver-streaked hair. How could he possibly explain? That he had spent decades chasing a version of success that now felt meaningless. That he had convinced himself she was just a memory, only to find her here. Like this? "I didn't know you were—" His voice faltered, unwilling to say the word. Her lips curled slightly, not in amusement but in something bitter. "Homeless?" she finished for him. The word lodged itself in his chest like a knife. Eleanor shook her head, her fingers gripping the fabric of her coat. "Why are you here, Richard?" Because fate had ripped open a wound he thought had long since healed, because the past had never really let go of him, because he couldn't walk away. Instead of answering, he took off his coat. The biting air nipped at his skin as he draped it over her frail shoulders, the heavy wool swallowing her small frame. Eleanor stiffened, but didn't push it away. "Come with me," he said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. She gave a short, humorless laugh. "Where?" "My place." The thought of leaving her out here, lost in a world that had long since abandoned her, made his stomach twist. Somewhere warm. Eleanor's gaze darkened. "Richard." She hesitated, her lips pressing together before she shook her head. "You don't understand." "Then help me understand." His voice was steady, but his heart thundered in his chest. She was silent for a long time. The wind howled down the alley, rattling discarded cans and newspapers. Finally, she exhaled shakily. "I don't need your pity." "This isn't pity, Eleanor," he said, kneeling beside her. It's the first thing that's felt real in a long time." Her eyes flickered with something. Hesitation, maybe even longing. But then she looked away, pulling the coat tighter around herself. Richard clenched his jaw. "I can't just leave you here." She let out another dry laugh, shaking her head. "And what? Sweep me into your penthouse like some charity project?" His stomach twisted at the words. That's not what this is. Eleanor studied him for a long moment. Then, without another word, she slowly pushed herself up onto unsteady legs. Richard moved to help her, but she recoiled slightly, as though touch itself had become a foreign thing to her. He let his hands fall to his sides, aching with the weight of everything left unsaid. "Fine," she murmured, swaying slightly but standing firm. "Just for tonight." Relief surged through him, but he said nothing. Instead, he guided her toward the waiting car, his driver's gaze flicking to the rearview mirror in surprise but wisely remaining silent. The ride to his home was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of fabric as Eleanor pulled his coat closer. She didn't look at him, staring out at the city with an expression he couldn't decipher. Richard studied her reflection in the window. The years had not been kind to her. The fire in her eyes, the defiant spark that once set his world alight, had dimmed beneath layers of hardship. Guilt gnawed at him. He had let her go. All those years ago, when their worlds had started pulling apart, he had convinced himself it was for the best. That love wasn't enough to survive on, that she would be fine without him. He had been wrong. The car pulled up to his home, a towering structure of glass and steel. Eleanor stared at it, expression unreadable. Richard stepped out first, turning to help her, but she was already moving, her steps slow, deliberate. As they entered the warmth of his penthouse, she hesitated just inside the doorway, as though afraid the moment she stepped too far in, she'd wake up and realize this was all a dream. He motioned toward the living room. "Sit. I'll get you something warm." She didn't move right away. Her eyes roamed the space, the high ceilings, the leather furniture, the marble floors. Then, finally, she sat, perching at the edge of the couch like a guest overstaying their welcome. Richard disappeared into the kitchen, his hands shaking as he poured a cup of tea. The absurdity of it all struck him. How easily he had fallen back into caring. How desperately he wanted to fix something that might be far beyond repair. When he returned, she was still staring at nothing, lost in thought. He set the cup on the coffee table in front of her. Eleanor looked at it, then at him. "Why are you doing this?" Richard swallowed hard. "Because I should have done something a long time ago." She let out a slow breath, steam curling from the cup as she wrapped her hands around it. "I don't even know what to say to you." "Then don't say anything," he murmured. "Just stay." Eleanor didn't answer. But she took a sip of tea, and for now, that was enough. The silence between them stretched, thick and weighty, punctuated only by the quiet clink of porcelain as Eleanor set the teacup back down. Richard watched her carefully, searching for something, some flicker of the girl he had once known beneath the exhaustion carved into her features. But if she was still there, she was buried deep. She hadn't taken off the coat. It swallowed her frame, the heavy wool draped over her shoulders like armor, as though at any moment she expected to be told to leave. Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Where have you been all these years?" he asked, his voice gentler than he'd intended. Eleanor let out a quiet, breathy laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Everywhere and nowhere." She ran a hand over her face, fingers lingering over her temple as if pushing back a headache. "I was fine for a while, got married, had a life." The mention of marriage sent a strange pang through his chest, but he said nothing. She exhaled sharply. And then, like most things, it fell apart. He lost his job. We lost the house. Then he lost himself. And Her voice trailed off. Her fingers tightened around the cup, knuckles pale. "Well, you see where I ended up." Richard felt something in his chest cave in. She had been suffering while he had been thriving. She must have seen the shift in his expression because she let out a weary sigh. "Don't look at me like that." "Like what?" "Like I'm some tragedy," she muttered, shaking her head. "Like I'm a broken thing you need to fix." Richard straightened, his jaw clenching. "I don't see you that way, don't you?" She met his gaze then, sharp and piercing despite her weariness. "What is this then? Some attempt at redemption? Guilt?" "I don't know," he admitted. It was the truth, and it tasted bitter. Eleanor studied him for a moment before leaning back, pulling the coat tighter around herself. "Well," she said, her voice quieter now, "whatever it is, it's misplaced." Richard exhaled, dragging a hand down his face. This wasn't going how he had imagined, not that he had imagined this at all. He stood abruptly, pacing toward the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the glowing city skyline. "Let me help you," he said, forcing himself to keep his voice steady. "Not just for tonight, really help you." Eleanor laughed, dry and hollow. "Help me how, Richard? Set me up in a nice little apartment? Get me a job? Do you think it's that easy?" "I don't know." His hands curled into fists. "But I can try," she scoffed. "You always did think money could solve everything." H turned to her then, frustration bubbling beneath his ribs. "And what's the alternative? Leaving you out there?" The words came out sharper than intended, but he couldn't take them back. Eleanor flinched. Regret hit him instantly. "Eleanor, I didn't mean." "It's fine," she interrupted, standing. The teacup wobbled slightly as she placed it back on the table. "I should go." "No," Richard said quickly, stepping toward her. "Stay." She hesitated. "You have nowhere else to go, do you?" he asked, his voice softer now. Eleanor's lips pressed together. He already knew the answer. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she sighed and sat back down. Richard let out a breath, sinking back into his own seat. His pulse was still hammering, but at least she wasn't walking out that door. The silence stretched between them again, heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. Then, quietly, Eleanor spoke. "I wasn't always like this, you know." Richard frowned. "I never thought you were." She gave him a wry look. "Didn't you?" He had no answer for that. Eleanor shook her head, staring down at her hands. "I was stubborn," she admitted. "Too proud to ask for help. Thought I could fix everything on my own. And then, one day, I couldn't." Richard's chest ached. "You should have called." Mathera gaze lifted to his, something unreadable flickering in her eyes. "Would you have answered?" He opened his mouth, ready to say yes, of course. But the words caught in his throat, because he wasn't sure. There had been a time when Eleanor had been his world, but that world had been left behind, buried beneath the weight of ambition, of success, of the relentless pursuit of something he hadn't even been able to name. Would he have answered? Or would he have convinced himself it was easier not to look back? Eleanor must have seen the hesitation in his face because she gave a small, knowing smile. "That's what I thought." The words stung. Richard exhaled, shaking his head. "You still don't trust me." Eleanor's expression softened slightly. "It's not about trust." She leaned back against the couch, her posture more exhausted than anything. "It's about time. Too much of it has passed. You can't just pick up the broken pieces and pretend nothing happened." He wanted to argue, to tell her that he could, that he would, make this right. But she was nighttime had built walls between them, walls that couldn't be torn down overnight. He leaned forward, his forearms resting on his knees. "Then let me prove it." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, searching his face for something. Then slowly, she nodded. Richard exhaled in relief. She was still here. That was all that mattered. But as he looked at her, really looked at her, he realized something else. This wasn't just about Eleanor. It was about the version of himself he had lost. And for the first time in years, Richard Caldwell felt something stir in his chest. Something that had nothing to do with money, power, or the weight of his own name. Something real. The night stretched on, heavy with unspoken words. Eleanor remained curled on the couch, her hands wrapped around the cooling cup of tea, staring at nothing in particular. Richard sat across from her, his elbows resting on his knees, watching her with quiet intensity. She was here. That should have been enough. But it wasn't. The weight of the years apart pressed against him like an unseen force, whispering accusations. You never looked for her. You let her disappear. And now you think you can fix this? I should get some sleep, Eleanor murmured, breaking the silence. Richard straightened. I'll set up a room for you. Eleanor hesitated, glancing toward the darkened hallway leading deeper into his penthouse. He saw the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, the hesitation of someone who had spent too long without a place to call their own. I won't lock you in, Eleanor, he said softly. A ghost of a smile played at her lips. You always did have a dramatic streak. Richard stood. Come on. He led her down the hall, past the rooms filled with things that had once mattered. Shelves of books, paintings from artists he'd long since stopped admiring, awards and plaques from a career built on ambition. Now, all of it felt hollow. He stopped at the guest room and pushed the door open, revealing a space bathed in warm, muted light. A king-sized bed, fresh sheets, a view of the city stretching endlessly beyond the glass. It was luxurious, far removed from where she had been. Eleanor stepped inside cautiously, her fingers brushing against the soft fabric of the comforter. This is too much, she whispered. Richard shook his head. It's a bed, Eleanor. You deserve at least that. She exhaled softly, something unreadable crossing her face. Then, after a moment, she turned to him. Thank you. Richard hesitated. There was so much more he wanted to say, so much more he needed to ask, but something told him this wasn't the time. Good night, Eleanor, he said instead. She gave a small nod before closing the door behind her. Richard stood there for a long moment, staring at the wood as if it might give him answers. Then, with a slow breath, he turned and walked away. But sleep did not come easily. He lay awake in his own room, staring at the ceiling, his mind tangled in memories. He had been 19 when he last saw Eleanor, the summer before he left for university, before life pulled them in different directions. He had promised to come back for her, promised that nothing would change. But everything had changed. His studies had consumed him, then his career, then the hunger for more success, more power, more everything. And Eleanor, she had become a distant ache, a name buried beneath meetings and mergers and things that never really mattered. Until now. Now she was here, and she was nothing like the girl he had left behind. A bitter thought coiled in his mind. Maybe I don't deserve a second chance. Sleep eventually took him, restless and fragmented. And when he woke, it was to the scent of coffee and the sound of soft movement in the kitchen. Richard pushed himself up, running a hand through his hair before making his way toward the sound. Eleanor stood at the counter, her back to him, wearing the same clothes from last night but looking slightly more alive. A fresh pot of coffee steamed beside her, and she was staring out the window, lost in thought. For a moment, he just watched her. Then, clearing his throat, he stepped forward. You're up early. Eleanor glanced over her shoulder, arching a brow. Old habits. You learn to wake up with the sun when you don't have a place to sleep. Richard's stomach twisted. She turned fully, crossing her arms. I suppose you expect me to stay here. Take your offer. Let you… What? Rescue me? Richard sighed. Eleanor, it's not about that, isn't it? She took a step closer, her eyes sharp, guarded. You think because you found me on the street you can rewrite what happened? That you can ease your conscience by throwing me a lifeline? Richard's jaw clenched. I just want to help. Help? Her voice was soft, almost amused, but there was steel beneath it. Then tell me, Richard, where were you when I needed help the most? The words landed like a punch to the gut. She didn't give him a chance to answer before turning away, shaking her head. I'm not your unfinished project. I'm not something you can fix with a check and a pitying look. Richard exhaled sharply. That's not what this is. Then what is it? She spun back around, her voice rising slightly. Because all I see is a man who couldn't be bothered to look for me when it mattered, but now suddenly wants to play hero. The accusation stung because it was true. He hadn't looked for her. He had moved on, convinced himself that she had too. And now, standing here in his kitchen, he realized just how much damage that neglect had done. Eleanor's expression hardened. "I won't be your redemption story, Richard." She turned and walked away, her footsteps fading down the Richard's jaw clenched. "I just want to help." "Help?" Her voice was soft, almost amused, but there was steel beneath it. "Then tell me, Richard, where were you when I needed help the most?" The words landed like a punch to the gut. She didn't give him a chance to answer before turning away, shaking her head. "I'm not your unfinished project. I'm not something you can fix with a check and a pitying look." Richard exhaled sharply. "That's not what this is." "Then what is it?" She spun back around, her voice rising slightly. "Because all I see is a man who couldn't be bothered to look for me when it mattered, but now suddenly wants to play hero." The accusation stung because it was true. He hadn't looked for her. He had moved on, convinced himself that she had too. And now, standing here in his kitchen, he realized just how much damage that neglect had done. Eleanor's expression hardened. "I won't be your redemption story, Richard." She turned and walked away, her footsteps fading down the hall. Richard stood there, gripping the edge of the counter, his breath shallow. He had thought bringing her here would be enough, that offering her comfort, safety, a way out, would somehow mend what had been broken. But he was beginning to realize that some wounds ran too deep for simple kindness to heal. And Eleanor? She wasn't sure she wanted to be saved. Richard stood there long after Eleanor had gone, the echo of her words settling deep in his chest. "Where were you when I needed help the most?" The weight of the question hung over him like a storm cloud. He had no answer. Or maybe he did, but he couldn't bear to speak it aloud. He had been everywhere but where he should have been. With a slow exhale, he pushed away from the counter and ran a hand through his hair. The familiar hum of the city beyond the windows felt distant, muffled, as though he was separated from the world by an invisible wall. "I won't be your redemption story." Maybe she was right. Maybe he didn't deserve to step back into her life after all this time. But he also couldn't just let her walk out the door. Not again. Richard moved down the hall, hesitating outside the guest room door. He raised his hand to knock, then stopped. What would he even say? That he was sorry? That he should have looked for her? Should have tried harder to keep the promises he made when they were young? Words felt useless now. Instead, he stepped away, leaving her with the space she clearly needed. But Eleanor had other plans. When he entered the living room a few minutes later, she was already there, fully dressed, her hair pulled back, his coat draped over her arm. "I'm leaving," she said simply. A sharp pang of something close to panic surged through him. "Where will you go?" Eleanor lifted a shoulder in a half shrug. "Back to where you found me, I guess." "No," he said, his voice firm. "I'm not letting that happen." She arched a brow. "Letting?" He cursed under his breath, shaking his head. "That's not what I meant. Eleanor, you can't go back to that life." She let out a hollow laugh. "And what life do you think I have waiting for me, Richard? A job? A home? Some grand magical solution to everything I've lost?" "I don't know," he admitted, stepping closer. "But I know you deserve better than this." Eleanor's gaze softened, but only for a moment. Then she inhaled sharply, as if resetting herself. "This isn't your responsibility," she murmured. "I don't belong here. Yes, you do." His voice was barely above a whisper. "You always did." She shook her head, gripping his coat a little tighter. "You don't get to say that. Not after all these years." Richard exhaled, frustration and desperation swirling inside him. "Then tell me how to make this right." Eleanor met his gaze, something flickering behind her tired eyes. "You can't," she said finally. The words landed like a gut punch. Still, he refused to let this be the end of the conversation. "Stay," he said, voice raw. "Just for a little while. Give yourself a chance." She hesitated, and for the first time since she had stepped into his home, Richard saw something he hadn't expected to find in her eyes. Fear, not of him, not of this place, but of hope, because hope had betrayed her before, and she wasn't sure she could survive it doing so again. The city outside was a vast, glittering expanse, stretching beyond the horizon in an endless sea of light. From Richard's penthouse, the world seemed almost peaceful, an illusion of serenity painted in neon and glass. But within the quiet walls of his home, where Eleanor stood at the edge of something she couldn't quite name, there was no peace, just a gnawing, aching emptiness. She held his coat tightly around her, though she wasn't sure why. It wasn't the warmth she needed. It was the weight of it, the unfamiliar sensation of being wrapped in something safe. It had been years since she'd felt that. So long, in fact, that she wasn't sure she even remembered how to accept it. Richard was watching her. She could feel his gaze, steady, unwavering, but she couldn't meet it. She had thought about running. Even now, her instincts screamed at her to leave before this could hurt her more than it already had. But something in her bones resisted. She had spent years disappearing, slipping through cracks, becoming invisible. Maybe for once she just wanted to be seen. "I don't know how to do this," she murmured. Richard stepped closer. "Do what?" She shook her head, exhaling slowly. "This. Any of it. Trusting. Believing that this isn't just temporary." He didn't answer right away, and she was almost relieved. She wasn't sure she could handle easy reassurances, empty promises wrapped up in well-meaning words. But when he did speak, his voice was quiet, careful. "It doesn't have to be." She turned to face him then, finally meeting his gaze. There was something raw in his expression, something that unnerved her. He meant it. Eleanor swallowed hard. "You don't get it, Richard. You don't know what it's like to fall this far, to have nothing, to watch everything you ever were just slip away." She saw the way his jaw tightened, the flicker of emotion behind his eyes. "Then tell me," he said. Eleanor let out a soft, breathless laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Where do I even start? Anywhere." She hesitated, fingers curling into the fabric of the coat. "I lost my job first, then the apartment. My husband, he was already gone before that, but I didn't want to see it. And then, piece by piece, everything else followed. I kept thinking, if I just held on a little longer, if I just tried harder, it would turn around." Richard's hands clenched at his sides. But it didn't. She looked down. "And one day, I woke up and realized I had nowhere left to go." The confession sat heavy in the air between them. "I didn't choose this," she whispered. "I didn't wake up one day and decide to be this person, but it happened anyway. And I survived. Barely. And now you're standing here telling me that it doesn't have to be this way, like it's that simple." Richard exhaled sharply. "I know it's not simple. Do you?" Her voice was quieter now. "Because all I see is a man who has never had to wonder, never had to question if he'd eat that day, never had to sleep with one eye open because the streets don't care who you used to be." Richard flinched. Not because she was wrong, but because she was right. He had never known real hunger, real fear. His struggles had been different, shaped by ambition, by choices he got to make. Eleanor's struggles had been about survival. There was no comparison. And yet, she was here. That had to mean something. "I won't pretend I understand what you've been through," he said finally. "But I do know that you don't deserve to keep living like this." She looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, she turned back toward the window, pressing her fingers lightly against the glass. "I used to love cities," she murmured. "I used to think they were full of possibility, that if you just kept moving, you'd find something worth holding on to." Richard stepped closer. "And now?" "Now, they just feel empty." The words sank deep. He took another step forward, careful not to push too hard. "Eleanor, you don't have to keep running." She let out a soft, breathless laugh. "That's the thing, Richard. I don't know how to stop." For a long time, neither of them spoke. Eleanor's fingers traced invisible patterns against the window pane. Richard simply watched her, feeling utterly useless. He had built a life on fixing things, on control, but none of that mattered here. None of that could undo the years that had broken her down piece by piece. And maybe that was the lesson. Maybe Eleanor wasn't something to be fixed. Maybe she just needed someone who wouldn't look away. He stepped beside her, close but not touching. "Then don't stop," he said. "But maybe just rest for a while." Eleanor swallowed hard, her throat tightening. She wanted to argue, to tell him it wasn't that simple. But God, she was so tired, and for the first time in years, she wasn't alone. Her grip on the coat loosened. Slowly, cautiously, she let herself breathe. Maybe, just maybe, she could stay. For now. The morning light bled softly into the room, golden and gentle, stretching across the marble floors of Richard's penthouse. Eleanor stood at the window, arms wrapped tightly around herself, staring at the skyline as if searching for something she had long lost. Richard watched her from across the room. She hadn't slept, not really. He had woken up hours ago, the weight of her presence in his home a constant hum in the back of his mind, and found her exactly where she stood now. As if she was afraid that if she let herself rest, this would all disappear. She hadn't run. That should have been enough, and yet there was something unspoken between them, a thread stretched thin, dangerously close to snapping. "You should eat something," Richard said finally, his voice low. Eleanor flinched slightly, as if he had startled her out of some deep thought. She turned toward him, her face unreadable. "I'm not hungry." Richard exhaled through his nose. He didn't argue. Instead, he moved toward the kitchen, filling the silence with the quiet clatter of plates and the hum of the coffee machine. Eleanor remained still, unmoving, until he placed a plate of toast and eggs in front of her. She looked down at it, her fingers twitching slightly at her sides. "You don't have to eat all of it," Richard said, leaning against the counter. "But I need you to try." She hesitated, then reached for the fork, slow and careful, as if testing her own body's reaction to the simple act of nourishment. She took a bite, small, hesitant, but something. Richard let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. Then, softly, Eleanor said, "I don't know how to do this." Richard frowned. "Do what?" She set the fork down, staring at her hands. "Be in a place like this. Feel like I deserve it." The words twisted something deep inside him. "You do," he said simply. Eleanor let out a hollow laugh, shaking her head. "You say that like it's fact." "It is." She looked up at him then, something fragile flickering behind her gaze. "You don't get it, Richard. This isn't just about me being homeless. It's about what I became." Richard stiffened. "And what do you think that is?" Eleanor hesitated. Then, almost in a whisper, "Nothing." His chest ached. He pushed away from the counter, moving closer. "That's not true." She let out a soft breath, her eyes dropping back to the table. "You don't know what I did to survive. The choices I had to make. The things I told myself were okay because there wasn't another option." Richard's stomach tightened. How far had she fallen? What had she endured that made her believe she was unworthy of something as simple as safety? He reached across the table, carefully placing his hand over hers. She tensed but didn't pull away. "It doesn't matter," he said. "None of it changes who you are." Eleanor looked up at him, her expression raw. "But it does, Richard. It does." Her voice cracked, and for the first time since she had stepped into his home, she looked small, not because of her frailty, but because of the weight she carried. And then suddenly, it was too much. She stood abruptly, shoving the chair back with a scrape against the floor. I need to go," she said, her voice uneven. Richard's pulse spiked. "Eleanor." She was already moving, heading toward the door, desperation in her steps. Richard didn't think. He just acted. He caught up to her before she could reach the door, stepping in front of her. "Where?" he asked, his voice sharp, urgent. "Where will you go?" Eleanor clenched her jaw. "Anywhere but here. Because it's easier to run?" She flinched, her fists tightening. "Because it's safer." Richard's heart pounded. He could feel the moment slipping through his fingers, the distance stretching between them again, threatening to pull her away. "Eleanor, please," he said, voice lower now. "Don't do this." Her breath hitched. For a brief second he saw something flicker in her eyes. Fear, vulnerability, something unnamed. Then, just as quickly, she masked it. "I can't," she whispered. And then she pushed past him. Richard stood frozen for a moment, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. Then, cursing under his breath, he followed her. Richard reached the elevator just as Eleanor pressed the call button. The light flickered, and the doors slid open with a soft chime. She stepped forward, but before she could cross the threshold, he caught her wrist. Not tight, not enough to trap her, just enough to stop her from vanishing again. "Eleanor," he said, his voice raw, his chest tight with something he couldn't name. "If you walk out that door, I don't think I can find you again." She froze. The weight of his words hung in the air between them. Her hand trembled beneath his touch. He could feel it, the way she was balancing on the edge, teetering between staying and disappearing forever. "I can't do this, Richard," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I can't pretend that I belong in your world, that I'm still someone worth." "Don't," he cut in, his voice firm. "Don't finish that sentence." Eleanor squeezed her eyes shut, shaking her head. "You don't understand, then make me understand." She exhaled sharply, pulling away from him. Not running this time, just distancing herself, as if putting space between them might make this hurt less. "I spent years surviving in ways I never thought I would," she said, her voice hoarse. "I begged, I stole. I made deals I hated myself for." Her breath hitched, and every time I thought I'd hit rock bottom, I fell further, and further, and further. Richard's hands curled into fists at his sides. He hated the pain in her voice, hated the way she spoke as if she was beyond saving. "You survived," he said. "That's not something to be ashamed of." Eleanor let out a bitter laugh. "You say that because you don't know what I had to do to survive." Richard took a slow step toward her. "Then tell me." She looked up at him, something desperate flickering in her gaze. "And what? You'll still look at me like this? Like I'm the same girl you knew?" He didn't hesitate. "You are." Her breath caught. Richard softened his tone. "You think I see you as weak? As ruined?" He shook his head. "I see a woman who clawed her way through hell and survived." Eleanor turned away, pressing her hands against the cool metal of the elevator doors. "You're wrong, Richard. I didn't survive. I lost everything." "Not everything," he said. "You still have me." The words landed between them like a shockwave. Eleanor tensed, as if they had hit something deep inside her, something she had long buried. She swallowed hard. "I don't know if that's enough." Richard's chest ached. He had spent years building walls around his emotions, keeping everything controlled, manageable. But with Eleanor, nothing had ever been manageable. Nothing had ever been safe. But she was the only thing that had ever felt real. "Then let me prove it is," he said, his voice steady. Eleanor turned to him, her eyes searching his. He could see it, the fight within her, the part of her that wanted to believe him, to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could stop running. But fear was a powerful thing. "You won't fix me," she whispered. "I'm not trying to." He stepped even closer, his voice quieter now. "I just don't want to lose you again." Eleanor's lip trembled. She took a shaky breath, her eyes never leaving his. For a moment, Richard thought she would walk away, and then she collapsed into his arms. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't cinematic. It was raw, messy, and heartbreaking. Her knees buckled, and he caught her, wrapping his arms around her thin frame as she shook against him. She wasn't crying. She was breaking. Richard held her tighter, anchoring her to him, as if his grip alone could keep her from slipping away. "You're okay," he murmured against her hair. "You're safe." For the first time in years, Eleanor let herself believe it. She didn't move. She didn't fight. She stayed. And for now, that was enough. Eleanor stayed in Richard's arms for what felt like forever. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them moved. The city outside pulsed with life. But here, in this quiet moment, it felt as if the world had stilled. Richard wasn't sure when she stopped shaking. He only knew that eventually her breathing evened out, and the weight of her against him shifted from desperation to something softer, something close to surrender. "I don't know what I'm doing," she admitted, her voice muffled against his chest. Richard exhaled, his chin resting lightly atop her head. "Neither do I." Eleanor let out a breathy, humorless laugh. "That's not reassuring. It's the truth." She pulled back slightly, just enough to look up at him. There was something different in her gaze now. Not trust, not yet, but the possibility of it. "I should still go," she murmured, but there was no conviction behind it. Richard reached up, gently tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "You don't have to." Eleanor searched his face as if looking for a reason to argue. Then, after a long pause, she let out a slow breath. "I don't know how to be here." Richard nodded, understanding the depth of what she meant. It wasn't about his penthouse. It wasn't about luxury or comfort. It was about belonging. "I don't expect you to have the answers right now," he said. "Just take it one moment at a time." She bit her lip, looking away. "That sounds easier than it is." "I know." For a while she said nothing, just standing there with the weight of his coat still draped around her. Then, with hesitant steps, she moved past him, back into the living room. She lowered herself onto the couch, not stiffly, not on edge, but tentatively. Richard followed, watching carefully as she rubbed at her temples, exhaustion catching up to her. "You should rest," he said. Eleanor smirked slightly. "That's rich, coming from you." Richard huffed out a small laugh. "Fair point." She hesitated before speaking again. "You really think this can work? That I can just stay here and suddenly figure out how to be a person again?" Richard sat down beside her, leaving space but still close enough that she could feel his presence. "I don't expect it to be sudden, but I do think you deserve the chance to try." Eleanor swallowed hard. "And what if I fail?" Richard didn't miss a beat. "Then we try again." A long silence stretched between them, heavy but not unbearable. Then, with slow, careful movements, Eleanor leaned back against the couch, exhaling. She wasn't leaving, and for now, that was enough. The following days passed like a delicate balancing act. Eleanor stayed, but she never fully settled, her movements careful, her presence light, as if afraid she might be intruding on a life that wasn't hers. Richard noticed the way she kept to the edges of rooms, the way she flinched at small sounds, the way she hesitated before accepting anything he offered. But she was trying. That was more than he could have asked for. On the third morning, he found her sitting at the kitchen counter, staring into a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. The steam curled in the air, dissolving into nothing. "You don't have to be afraid of taking up space here," he said, keeping his voice gentle. Eleanor glanced up at him. "I'm not afraid." He gave her a pointed look. She sighed, dropping her gaze. "Okay. Maybe I am." Richard leaned against the counter, watching her carefully. "Eleanor, this isn't a favor. You don't have to earn your right to be here." Her fingers curled around the cup, tension coiling in her shoulders. "That's easy for you to say." His brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" She swallowed, staring down at the dark liquid in her hands. "You've always belonged wherever you went, Richard. You walk into a room and it's yours. People listen to you. They make space for you." She let out a quiet breath. "I don't remember what that feels like." Richard's heart ached at her words. How long had she been made to feel invisible? "You don't have to prove anything to me," he said firmly. Eleanor let out a humorless laugh. "Then what do I do?" He hesitated, then pushed a plate of toast toward her. "Start by eating something." She arched a brow. "Are you going to force-feed me now, if I have to?" A ghost of a smile flickered at the edges of her lips, and for the first time in days, Richard saw a glimpse of the girl he used to know. It wasn't much, but it was something. She sighed, finally picking up the toast. "You're relentless," he smirked. "It's one of my more charming qualities." Eleanor rolled her eyes but took a small bite. Richard pretended not to notice the way her hands trembled slightly. Baby steps. She wasn't running, and that was enough. A shift in the air. As the days stretched into a week, Richard saw small changes in her. She started to eat more, not much but enough that he no longer worried about her collapsing. She slept, though her rest was fitful, haunted by dreams she never spoke of. She let him sit with her in the evenings, the silence between them less tense, less guarded. But she was still waiting for something to break, waiting for the moment he would tell her she had overstayed her welcome. One night, as they sat in the living room, the city lights painting shadows against the walls, she finally said it. "This can't last forever." Richard turned to look at her. "Why not?" Eleanor exhaled, shaking her head. "Because it's not real. Because sooner or later you'll realize that I don't belong here." His jaw tightened. "You keep saying that, like you're some kind of burden." She flinched but didn't deny it. Richard ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "Eleanor, I need you to hear me. You are not an inconvenience." She said nothing. He softened his voice. "I don't know how to make you believe that, but I'll keep saying it until you do." Eleanor looked at him then, really looked at him, and for a moment, he thought she might cry. But instead she whispered, "Okay," and that was the moment Richard knew. She was staying. Maybe not forever, maybe not in the way he wanted, but for now. And for the first time in years, that was enough. Sometimes life gives us second chances, not just at love, but at healing, redemption, and finding our way home. Eleanor thought she was beyond saving, but she wasn't. And maybe neither are we. What would you do if fate brought someone from your past back into your life? Would you walk away, or would you fight for them? If this story moved you, let us know in the comments. Have you ever reconnected with someone in an unexpected way? Share your thoughts, like this video, and subscribe for more powerful stories that remind us of the beauty in second chances.